All of the leaders whose sketches follow served in the Pacific. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz was General MacArthur's counterpart in that area. He had command of the Central Pacific, and MacArthur had command of the Southwest Pacific. Admiral Nimitz was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, including the Marine Force, from just after the attack on Pearl Harbor till the end of the war. He was a strong believer in amphibious operations and the leapfrog strategy, and applied them to take the Japanese-held islands. In the drive to invade the Japanese home islands, Nimitz had argued for the taking of Formosa, as opposed to MacArthur's plan to recapture the Philippines. However, the Joint Chiefs opted in MacArthur's favor, and Nimitz's fleet supported the landings on Mindanao and in Leyte Gulf. In the end, the Japanese surrendered aboard Nimitz's flagship, the USS Missouri.
Texas was a prospering state in 1885 when Chester Nimitz was born in the tiny town of Fredericksburg. There was room on the great western plains where a man could run cattle or farm and grow with America. Nimitz's people were pioneer stock, and their faith in their country's future formed the bedrock of their children's heritage. Although his pioneering grandfather had once followed the sea, there was little else in the boy's landlocked environment to point him towards the Navy. But while Nimitz grew, America's Navy grew too. The 100-year-old Constellation was still in use to train men during the Spanish-American War. But our sea battles were fought by revolutionary armored steam warships. There were many spokesmen for the new Navy, not the least of them Theodore Roosevelt. Ours was still a young country, and it was a two-ocean country. The Navy, which had sent the Spanish fleet to the bottom, was necessary to our defense and to our future security. The year Teddy Roosevelt entered the White House, young Chester Nimitz entered the Naval Academy. The future fleet admiral had never seen an ocean when he journeyed east. But like all young men away from home, he soon became accustomed to his new environment. He learned the Navy from the keel up and grew to love the tough and demanding life he shared with his fellow midshipmen. The physical training was as rigorous as the bookwork. At a school where the traditions of Jones and Decatur, Porter and Dewey governed a midshipman's life. Although American naval tradition ran back to the Revolution, the service itself during Nimitz's days at Annapolis looked to the future. Nimitz was graduated 7th in a class of 114. Regulations required him to serve 2 years at sea as a passed midshipman before becoming an ensign in the regular Navy. This early technological marvel, one of our first submarines, was being tested for the Navy at the time Chester Nimitz joined the fleet. After duty in the Far East during the first few years of his career, Nimitz was selected with other outstanding young men to form what eventually became our Navy's submarine force. Lieutenant Nimitz wrote prophetically in a naval journal of 1912, "Improvement in the size, motive power, and speed of the submarine craft of the near future will result in a most dangerous offensive weapon." His prediction would be borne out by the importance of submarine action in the First World War. By 1918, Nimitz was one of the most experienced submariners in the service and a commander. But a broad and varied background was essential to a man's career in the complex Navy, and the best place to acquire it was the surface fleet. Nimitz, when a captain, went on to command major warships in the 20s and 30s, including the cruisers Chicago and Augusta. During these years, he had full opportunity to study the kind of sea and air operations which later proved so successful in the war against Japan. In these same decades, the Japanese constructed one of the finest fleets the world had ever seen. On the fateful day of December 7th, 1941, at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy was ready. flames had hardly died before Chester Nimitz was called from a desk in Washington to take command of the Pacific Fleet. It was a dark time and a formidable task. It would take a man of vast experience and vigor to bring both hope and victory out of wreckage and chaos. It would take a Nimitz. The Japanese quickly followed their surprise success at Pearl Harbor with territorial grabs across the Western Pacific as American forces fought and lost against overwhelming odds. By the spring of 1942, Japan controlled most of the land and dominated the sea and air west of Pearl Harbor. It was up to our Navy to hold the line. But if we underestimated the Japanese, they also underestimated us. When they disabled the cream of our fleet at Pearl Harbor, they did not realize that we could recover so quickly. It was clear that we had to strike back in force. But where? Nimitz had a much smaller fleet than the enemy, and he was determined to use it. Where? The Coral Sea. Our forces met the enemy at Midway, too. The boldness and surprise of Nimitz's strategy in these two major engagements were enough to change the course of the war in the Pacific. The Battle of the Coral Sea and Midway were our first decisive victories. Nimitz expressed the gratitude of the nation when he decorated many of the Navy pilots and sailors who had helped turn back the enemy. As the war in the Pacific slowly changed from one of desperate defense to one of confident offense, the men who directed it found the need for careful coordination ever greater. The combined Navy and Army forces under both Nimitz and MacArthur worked smoothly to batter down the walls of Japan's Pacific Empire. But the war could not be viewed on maps, and the grand strategy which defeated the enemy could not all be planned within the conference room. On an inspection tour with Admiral Halsey and Navy Secretary Frank Knox, Nimitz conferred with combat veterans in the Solomons following our bitter 6-month struggle for Guadalcanal. On Kwajalein Island, Nimitz inspected what was left of Japanese defenses. After the American fleet and ground forces had hit the island, wrecked equipment and fire-scorched beaches told the story of our success. Before the Pacific fighting entered its final phase, with the recapture of the Philippines and the final thrust at the Japanese homeland, MacArthur and President Roosevelt met with Nimitz at CINCPAC headquarters in Hawaii. Our capture of Saipan immediately before the meeting meant that a major rupture had been accomplished in Japan's inner defense perimeter. Although Nimitz and the other American leaders were unaware of it at the time, the Japanese General Staff was already asking its government for a peace settlement with the United States. The Americans did know, however, that Premier Tojo had been forced to resign, and their confidence was high. Plans for retaking the Philippines were submitted and approved at this meeting. For Nimitz, there was no relaxation of responsibility. His life was filled with the critical business of high command as the tempo of the war increased and the relentless tide of American sea power swept forward. And behind his task, behind the decisions which moved the fleet ever closer to Japan, was the constant evaluation, the continuous re-examination of his strategy. Under his direction, Halsey, Spruance, Turner, and others used their forces with masterly precision and deadly effect, setting the pace for subordinate commanders. At New Guinea and the Marianas, the enemy felt our power. Finally, the day came for the Philippines. decision of Nimitz and MacArthur to skip the southern Philippine Islands paid off. And on October 20th, 1944, American soldiers stormed the Leyte beaches. As the Japanese prepared to defend themselves against the American attack, their adherence to a cause already lost carried them to fanatical excess. Few men on either side realized that the Leyte Gulf action, hoped for by Nimitz and earnestly sought by Halsey, would turn into one of the most far-reaching naval engagements of all time. Before the fighting ceased, the Leyte Gulf adventure cost the Japanese Navy 4 aircraft carriers, 9 destroyers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and all reasonable hope of ever winning a sea battle from the American fleet. For some of our men, too, Leyte Gulf was the last fight. Many brave Americans who died in this action were honored at sea by their comrades. The liberation of the Philippines soon became a certainty, and Nimitz urged his commanders forward. Halsey's carriers were both the cavalry and artillery of the Navy as they closed in upon the enemy. Island by island, American ground forces followed as the power of the Japanese war machine withered and began to die. But the Japanese were desperate men, and desperation breeds its own terrors. One of the most destructive was kamikaze, the spirit of the divine wind. We called them suicide planes. In the Philippines, they came like fierce hornets. They attacked alone and they attacked in bunches. For a while, it seemed they would never stop coming. Just before Easter of 1945, Nimitz's ships hit Okinawa. All told, 183,000 troops participated in this epic landing, with the heaviest naval support in the Pacific. Okinawa represented the final, but by no means the easiest obstacle on the road to Japan. As the troops streamed inland from the beaches, the opposition stiffened. It was the last ditch for the Japanese. American casualties were high at Okinawa. But for men who had carried their strength and their faith so far in the 3½ years since Pearl Harbor, victory was now in sight. Okinawa became the death rattle of the Japanese resistance. With one last convulsive effort, enemy pilots drove their deadly planes at our fleet, but we were ready. In June, it ended. 4,000 enemy aircraft had found their graves, and the only fire in the skies now came from the setting sun. Nimitz went ashore at Okinawa to view the remains. The hope and confidence which had been born at the Coral Sea and Midway during the dark and doubtful days of 1942 were here fulfilled. These were the men who had suffered the hardships of Guadalcanal and the frustration of New Guinea, men who had brought in ringing victories in the Philippines and on the tiny island of Iwo Jima. This was their final triumph. Okinawa, the doorsill of Japan. At Manila, Nimitz conferred with MacArthur on the work yet to be done. The concentrated naval and ground forces of the Allies were preparing for the final assault on the Japanese home islands. From long experience, both Nimitz and MacArthur expected that the Japanese would fight until driven into the sea. But the Japanese did not. With their military and naval might smashed beyond recovery, with their cities bombed to rubble, the enemy surrendered unconditionally. For Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, it was a solemn moment, a moment of grave reflection. Upon his return, a jubilant nation greeted him. A day was named in his honor, and the whole city of Washington turned out to say thanks. Crowds jammed the streets to get a glimpse of the man who had done so much to bring them victory. At the Capitol building, he went before a special joint session of Congress where he expressed his feelings to the assembled lawmakers.
I am sensible of the fact that I do not come here as an individual, and I acknowledge at the outset that I am here only as a representative of the brave men who fought under my command in the Pacific. Some of them are here with me today. I pray that no future war may ever again find us unprepared. Most of all, I pray that such a war does not begin and end to our disadvantage before we can even begin to fight. This need not happen to us. It will not happen to us if we exercise our intelligence, our vigilance, and use our good, plain common sense and keep our fighting forces ready.
The Admiral's welcome had its lighter side when he smoked the pipe of peace before beginning his new role as America's post-war Chief of Naval Operations. From Admiral Richard Byrd, the new chief received a briefing on the 1946 Navy expedition to the South Pole. One of the many honorary degrees he received was awarded in a colorful ceremony with other naval and military figures at Columbia University in 1947. After his tour as Chief of Naval Operations ended in 1948, Nimitz accepted a United Nations appointment as plebiscite administrator for Kashmir. Few of Nimitz's experiences with the United Nations yielded more pleasure than a visit from members of the Japanese Diet. Our one-time enemy had become our friend, and the man who had been instrumental in their defeat joined in welcoming them to the community of free nations. In 1951, Nimitz was still not ready to relax. After he resigned his United Nations post, President Truman appointed him chairman of a special commission on internal security. In the Berkeley Hills, not far from San Francisco, Nimitz lives quietly with his wife, but he continues to be active in naval affairs by serving as a special assistant to the Secretary of the Navy. A weather vane with 5 stars and a submarine replica are all that mark the Admiral's quarters. There is still much to keep him busy, and for the first time in many years, he also finds an opportunity to enjoy his garden. Nimitz is still bound to the sea and to the great American naval tradition. His contribution in strategy and leadership will be long remembered in the Navy, and his personal example admired by all men who follow the sea.
We were most fortunate in obtaining from the Department of Defense the following film on 3 Marine Corps generals: Alexander A. Vandegrift, Clifton B. Cate, and Holland M. Smith. For the sake of expediency, at this time, we've combined them all into this single segment. It's interesting to note that both Vandegrift and Cate served successively as commandants of the Marine Corps. General Vandegrift was awarded the Navy Cross and the Medal of Honor for his actions as commanding general of the 1st Marine Division at Guadalcanal. General Cate won the Navy Cross, Army Distinguished Service Cross, and Silver Star, and the French Legion of Honor for heroism during the First World War. In World War II, he distinguished himself as commanding general of the 4th Marine Division. Also a veteran of the First World War, General Smith led the 5th Amphibious Corps in the assaults on the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and the Marianas. He later served as the 1st commanding general of the Fleet Marine Force, Pacific, and headed Task Force 56 at Iwo Jima. I had the honor of meeting both General Vandegrift and Admiral Nimitz.
General Alexander A. Vandegrift took office as the 18th Commandant of the Marine Corps on January 1st, 1944, while his Marines were still heavily engaged in the Pacific. General Vandegrift had a number of firsts to his credit. He was the first 4-star general to hold the position of Commandant, and he was the commanding general of the 1st Marine Division to ever leave the shores of the United States. Furthermore, on August 7, 1942, in the Solomon Islands, he led the 1st Marine Division, reinforced, in the first large-scale offensive against the Japanese. Vandegrift was the hero of Guadalcanal, where he led his reinforced division against the well-entrenched Japanese forces. In that campaign, the 1st Marine Regiment of the 1st Marine Division was commanded by General Cate, who was a colonel at that time. General Vandegrift deserves even more credit, considering the fact that in the early days of the Guadalcanal campaign, his division was almost completely isolated since the Japanese had regained complete control of the air and sea around the island shortly after the Marines landed. For that action, the attack on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and Gavutu in the Solomon Islands, he was awarded the Navy Cross, and for the subsequent seizure and defense of the island, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. In part, his citation for the Medal of Honor reads as follows: with the adverse factors of weather, terrain, and disease, making his task a difficult and hazardous undertaking, and with his command eventually including sea, land, and air forces of the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps, Major General Vandegrift achieved marked success in commanding the initial landings of the United States forces in the Solomon Islands and in their subsequent occupation. His tenacity, courage, and resourcefulness prevailed against a strong, determined, and experienced enemy, and the gallant fight to withstand aerial, land, and sea bombardment, to surmount all obstacles and leave a disorganized and ravaged enemy. This dangerous but vital mission, accomplished at the constant risk of his life, resulted in securing a valuable base for further operations of our forces against the enemy. In July 1943, he assumed command of the 1st Marine Amphibious Corps and commanded this organization in the landing at Empress Augusta Bay, Bougainville, northern Solomon Islands, on November 1st, 1943. Upon establishing the initial beachhead, he relinquished command and returned to Washington, D.C. to take office as the Commandant of the Marine Corps. For outstanding service as Commandant, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. In addition to the Medal of Honor, Navy Cross, and Distinguished Service Medal, his decorations and medals included the Presidential Unit Citation with 1 Bronze Star, Navy Unit Commendation with 1 Bronze Star, Expeditionary Medal with 3 Bronze Stars, Nicaraguan Campaign Medal, Mexican Service Medal, Haitian Campaign Medal with 1 star, Victory Medal with West Indies Clasp and 1 star, Yangtze Service Medal, American Defense Service Medal, Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal with 4 Bronze Stars, American Campaign Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal. He also received a number of foreign decorations, including the French Legion of Honor, Grand Officer, and the Knight's Grand Cross in the Order of the Orange Nassau with Swords from the Netherlands. General Vandegrift retired in April 1949. General Clifton B. Cates has the distinction of being one of the few officers of any service who had commanded a platoon, a company, a battalion, a regiment, and a division under fire. He succeeded General Vandegrift and served as the 19th Commandant of the Marine Corps from January 1948 until January 1952. A varsity member of both the baseball and football teams at the University of Tennessee, where he studied law, the future Marine General, soon after graduation, reported for active duty on June 13, 1917, as a second lieutenant in the reserve. He plunged into a career that took him through 5 major engagements in the First World War and another 5 in World War II. His service with the Marine Corps ranged from duty at sea to duty at the White House, from platoon leader to commandant. During more than 37 years as a Marine, he was wounded several times and won nearly 30 decorations. In World War II, after commanding the 1st Marine Regiment in the Guadalcanal-Tulagi landings and the capture and defense of Guadalcanal, the general fought as commander of the 4th Marine Division in the Marianas Operation, the Tinian Campaign, and the seizure of Iwo Jima. He won the Legion of Merit with Combat V at Guadalcanal, the Distinguished Service Medal at Tinian, and a Gold Star in lieu of a 2nd Distinguished Service Medal at Iwo Jima. His Iwo Jima citation states in part, "A bold tactician, he landed his force on the southeast shore of the island against heavy enemy resistance, and defying the terrific continuous bombardment laid down by enemy guns, located strategically on high ground, which afforded direct observation and complete coverage of his entire zone of action, pushed his relentless advance through the shifting volcanic sands." Repeatedly disregarding his own personal safety, Major General Cates traversed his own front lines daily to rally his tired, depleted units, and by his undaunted valor, tenacious perseverance, and staunch leadership in the face of overwhelming odds, constantly inspired his stout-hearted Marines to heroic effort during critical phases of the campaign. As a young lieutenant with the 6th Marine Regiment in France during World War I, the general fought in the Verdun defensive sector, at Boresh and Belleau Wood in the Aisne defensive, at Soissons in the Aisne-Marne offensive, in the Marbache sector of the Saint-Mihiel offensive, and in the Blanc-Mont and Argonne forest engagements of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He won the Navy Cross, Army Distinguished Service Cross, and an Oak Leaf Cluster in lieu of a 2nd Distinguished Service Cross for heroism in the Boresh and Belleau Wood fighting, where he was both gassed and wounded. He won the Silver Star Medal at Soissons, where he was wounded a 2nd time, and an Oak Leaf Cluster in lieu of a 2nd Silver Star Medal in the Blanc-Mont fighting. Apart from those decorations and the Purple Heart Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, which he received for wounds, the French government recognized his heroism with the Legion of Honor and the Croix de Guerre with Gilt Star and 2 palms. He also was cited twice in the General Orders of the 2nd Division, and once by General Pershing, the commanding general AEF, and is entitled to wear the Fourragère Award of the 6th Marines. The epic Battle of Belleau Wood, in which General Cates distinguished himself, is one of the most heroic in the gallant history of the Marine Corps. Here they replaced the retreating French army, counterattacked against a more seasoned and numerically superior German force, and halted its advance on Paris. As part of the Army's 2nd Division, the 4th Marine Brigade performed so bravely that the French officially renamed Belleau Bois de la Brigade des Marines, Wood of the Brigade of Marines. The ferocious attack made by the Marines became a legendary symbol of American valor. The wood was not merely a heavily defended enemy position. It was a solid phalanx of well-entrenched machine guns, and the Marines moved out bayonets fixed without the artillery barrage to soften the enemy. They advanced, despite the hail of death hurled at them, spurred on by 2-time Medal of Honor winner Sergeant Dan Daly's "Come on, you sons of bitches, you want to live forever?" And they earned a new nickname from their German adversaries, who respectfully called them Teufelhunde, devil dogs. Then on June 26, 1918, General Pershing received a message stating, "Entire woods now occupied by United States Marines. But the price of victory in our first major battle with the Germans came high. We suffered many wounded and many dead." In addition, General Cate's medals include the Presidential Unit Citation Ribbon with 3 bronze stars, the World War I Victory Medal with 5 clasps, the Army of Occupation of Germany Medal, the Expeditionary Medal, the Yangtze Service Medal, the China Service Medal, the American Defense Service Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Area Campaign Medal with 1 silver star in lieu of 5 bronze stars, the American Area Campaign Medal, the World War II Victory Medal, the National Defense Service Medal, and the Netherlands Order of the Orange Nassau with crossed swords and rank of Grand Officer. General Cate retired in 1954. General Holland M. Smith, the officer who led the Marines to victory island hopping across the Pacific during World War II, was appointed a 2nd lieutenant on March 20th, 1905. Sometimes called the father of modern U.S. amphibious warfare, he was one of America's top commanders in the Pacific during World War II. He retired in 1946 after a 41-year career that included sea duty, expeditionary service from the Philippines to Haiti, fighting bandits in the Dominican Republic, and World War I combat in France. On the eve of World War II, General Smith directed extensive Army, Navy, and Marine amphibious training, which was a major factor in successful U.S. landings in both the Atlantic and Pacific. Later, he helped prepare U.S. Army and Canadian troops for the Kiska and Attu landings in Alaska, and then led the 5th Amphibious Corps in the assaults on the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and Saipan and Tinian in the Marianas. In the latter operation, in addition to the 5th Amphibious Corps, he commanded all expeditionary troops in the Marianas, including those who recaptured Guam. After that, he served as first commanding general of Fleet Marine Force Pacific and headed Task Force 56 expeditionary troops at Iwo Jima, which included all the assault troops in that battle. During the First World War, in June 1917, he sailed for France as commander of the 8th Machine Gun Company, 5th Marines. In France, General Smith was detached from the 5th Marines and sent to the Army General Staff College at Langres, from which he was graduated in February 1918. He was then named adjutant of the 4th Marine Brigade, in which capacity he fought in the Verdun sector and the Marne offensive, including the epic Battle of Belleau Wood. Transferred to the 1st Corps, 1st Army, July 1918, he served as Assistant Operations Officer in charge of liaison during the Marne, Saint-Mihiel, and Meuse-Argonne offensives. After the armistice, he participated in the March to the Rhine through Belgium and Luxembourg as an Assistant Operations Officer with the 3rd Army and served with the General Staff U.S. Army during the occupation of Germany. For his service at Belleau Wood, the general was awarded the Croix de Guerre with Palm by the French government. He also received a meritorious service citation from the Commander-in-Chief, American Expeditionary Forces, and was later awarded the Purple Heart. In the Second World War, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his part in training America's amphibious forces on both coasts. a Gold Star in lieu of a second one for his planning and execution of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands operations, a Gold Star in lieu of a third for similar services in the Marianas, and a Gold Star in lieu of a fourth for his part in the invasion and capture of Iwo Jima. He earned the nickname Howlin' Man for his quick temper and gruff attitude. Lieutenant General Smith lived up to his sobriquet in our invasion of Saipan in the Marianas. He was commanding general of the 5th Amphibious Corps as well as of all expeditionary troops in the Marianas. At Saipan, he had under his command 2 Marine divisions and the Army's 27th Division, a National Guard outfit from New York. Commanding the 27th was Major General Ralph C. Smith. The 27th was assigned the center position with the 2nd Marine Division on its left flank and the 4th Marine Division on its right. As the battle raged, Marine General Smith was dissatisfied with Army General Smith and the performance of the 27th. They were not advancing fast enough for him, and they were not suffering enough casualties. Marine General Smith then summarily relieved Army General Smith of his command. Later investigations showed that Army General Smith had exercised sound judgment and good leadership. The Army troops faced difficult terrain and were meeting stiff resistance, but this delay did expose the flanks of the Marine divisions which were advancing faster. Right or wrong, however, Marine General Smith earned the undying enmity of the Army's Professional Officer Corps. It is ironic that before getting his commission in the Marines, General Holland Smith had first applied for a commission in the Army and had been rejected. Yet as a Marine officer, he served with Army units and commands without apparent difficulty. Generally speaking, there was no feud or great difference of opinion between Army infantrymen and Marines. They served side by side in the First World War and in World War II. In fact, in the taking of Okinawa, the last stop in our Pacific Island hopping strategy, the Army's 77th Statue of Liberty Division started the invasion by landing on Kerma Island to secure a forward naval base, a task traditionally assigned to Marines. 3 weeks later, in an amphibious assault, the soldiers also seized Ieshima. The Marines of the 2nd and 6th Marine Divisions spoke with great respect about their soldier comrades in arms. They gave their Army buddies their greatest accolade by calling them the 77th Marine Division. That same 77th Division is today's New York 77th Army Reserve Command. In addition to the medals and decorations already mentioned, General Smith was also awarded the Marine Corps Expeditionary Medal with 3 Bronze Stars, the Mexican Service Medal, the Dominican Campaign Medal, the World War I Victory Medal with 5 sector clasps, the Army of Occupation of Germany Medal, the American Defense Service Medal with base clasp, the American Area Campaign Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Area Campaign Medal with 1 Silver Star in lieu of 5 Bronze Stars, the World War II Victory Medal, the Dominican Order of the First Merit, and the British Order of Commander of the Bath. Holland Smith retired in 1946 with the rank of Lieutenant General, but was promoted to 4-star rank for having been especially commended in combat.